Hello and welcome to Thrivalism's end of series wrap up. This is usually a bit where Dieter does a long, slightly boring monologue where he stumbles over a Word document that I've written him. But today we're here face to face to have a chat about what we've learned from 2 series of Thrivalism so far. Dieter, say hello.
Good morning, Toby. I'm disappointed that I can't do my long, boring monologue intro, and that means that I won't be doing it for the next series.
Well, to be honest, that's something I want to discuss with you anyway, so that's fine.
Okay,
we haven't got 2 hours this morning, that's fine. So why are we here today, Dieter?
Well, it's been a pretty good series, or 2 series, and we thought, well, we couldn't get any more guests, so we thought what we do is, as we've been the most common people doing interviews through it, why not interview each other and think about what we've loved, what we've challenged our thoughts, maybe, what we disagreed with.
Didn't even listen to the end of that because I'm just still rankling that you call me common. So what I think an interesting starting point is, in terms of the actual podcast itself, doing it, setting up, what has been challenging, or because I found it impossible to listen back to my own voice. I can't do it.
Is this a self-help podcast for people who are trying to do podcasts? Yeah. I would say it's definitely more difficult than you expect.
Yeah.
You need way more equipment than you would imagine. I would say we were hugely helped by a friend of ours who, up until the point of his introduction, it was all very amateur. But weirdly, we'd say absolute nonsense to him and it would come back sounding actually okay. I've realised now one of the best tricks of podcasting is you can pay. There's 2 grades to podcasting editing, and you pay a little bit more, and they take all the ums and ahs and pauses out of your conversation. So even when you sound a bit like you don't know what to say, they just magic with it, and it sounds okay.
Yeah, sometimes. There's only so much they can do. I found diary management impossible as well. Like actually trying to coordinate 3 or 4 people at the same time, even over Zoom, it's a non-starter, isn't it? Can't do it.
That's why you're not a project manager in our business.
Yeah, the admin escapes me. The chat is fine. The admin escapes me. It also took me a while to realise that editing means you don't have to worry too much about what you actually say, because you can delete. I mean, we've probably got 2.5 hours of deleted footage on the floor that isn't appropriate for broadcast.
Yeah, luckily for our listeners, there's probably not enough interesting content in the outcuts to put into everything.
Let's go back through the episodes that we've done. We've had some brilliant guests, actually, and we've got some more lined up for next year, which is awesome. Series 3 of Thrivalism will launch around February time with some brilliant guests in the pipeline, so more on that later. We started off talking to Lucy Summer from AutoCab, and that was a chat that you had. AutoCab, obviously, a sort of automated taxi booking system, got bought by Uber. She's head of culture there, installed to drive change through their culture, sort of cement it, build out as they scale. What were your key takeaways from your chat with her?
Well, yeah, I really liked Lucy. She was full of enthusiasm, wasn't she? And she had like the ultimate challenge, I thought, at AutoCab. That was weirdly being a tech business. It was actually quite an old business and was quite traditional and had, I suppose, a non-typical team, I think, in many ways, but then was growing really fast and had been bought out by Uber. I think the things that were really interesting is she kept going on about the key things that they had to do. I was really pleased because actually Interaction were doing a lot of those already, but it just goes to show, isn't it? It's definitely just all about connection, but you can't expect it to randomly just happen. You have to put some structure around it. You have to create situations where those bonds happen, whether that's online or in person. And that was a lot of the challenges they were having. But it was relatively simple, but consistent and thorough, and checking upon yourself and making sure you're doing the right thing, and checking back to the team and making sure they appreciated what you're doing, and then checking in the management to make sure we're in the right direction. But, it sounds simple. You need the right people to do it. And she clearly was really good.
That answer was almost as long as the actual podcast itself. So well done. I think one of the things that comes up a lot when we talk about culture, and all the guests have raised it to some level, is the idea of being deliberate in creating culture. Like you sort of touched on, not expecting to happen, but actually putting thought into what you do, what you don't do, how you track it. Because culture, although it is organic, needs a framework to work from. And that's something that I think all the guests have touched on in interesting ways. The second one, we spoke to Sarah Trehair-Williams from CubeX, and again, that was you. One thing I learned quite early on in that podcast is we need to pad the desks because there was quite a lot of background banging as glasses got put down. But we've really moved beyond that now, so that's good. So Sarah's obviously really passionate about getting people into the business, about more diversity within the business, people coming up through the ranks, about sustainability, about creating communities, all of which you covered in quite a sort of juicy podcast. So what were some takeaways for you in that one?
It was really refreshing, wasn't it? To not just with Sarah from CubeX, but obviously with Paul from CEG. There's been a massive change, I think, in the way developers are looking at their role. And that is hugely evolving all the way across that sector. And she talked a lot about placemaking and the importance of it and the importance that CubeX placed on it. And it was really refreshing. So that was the thing that I kept she just kept coming back to placemaking and about creating opportunities.
I feel that those topics can often come across as quite cynical and commercially driven. But actually with both of those guys, they felt really genuine and authentic. And that was really meaningful subjects for them to be progressing.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously good commercial practice to make a good place because office occupiers or any other occupiers of space, it's not just enough to have a white box anymore, is it? It's everything that goes around it, and they understand expectations are higher. It was refreshing, wasn't it? It was really great to hear it right from the horse's mouth of the people who were responsible for literally putting bricks and mortar together.
Yeah, their
passion. It wasn't just behind some PR.
I think you shared a certain passion in some sort of types of cement or something, which I don't know. Yeah, I don't know at that point. I'm sure everyone else was really.
Yeah, I think they edited that. Actually, yeah, I saw. Anybody wants a reinforced concrete?
What's your favourite type of reinforced concrete?
Or pre-stressed?
Pre-stressed. I would know all about that. After that, we spoke to, Debs, in fact, spoke to Joanna Watchman, covered a lot of topics in that, mental health, well buildings, the importance of light and biophilia, sort of blue collar versus white collar attitudes to wellness and stuff in the workplace. Any takeouts from that?
She was very good at reflecting back and positioning the things that we all know, which is bad buildings are really bad for you. And whether that's air, whether that's light, whether that's acoustics and sound, and we don't pay enough attention to them. And she made that, the comparison towards your facilities manager in the office that you might work in probably has more impact on your health than your doctor does. And that's a really good thing to think about. And we focus on the quality of the water in some of the buildings, or we focus on the heat and cool, but we don't really think as much about the air quality. And that's one of the things that's really changed at the pandemic. And it's a conversation that as an interaction we're probably always having, but I don't think we were really listening. And now people really think about air quality and fresh air a lot more. And, as we have to make an office much more of a destination and people have more of a choice about whether or not they go there, things like natural light and acoustics. Yeah, I mean, it's great. I'm so excited that these conversations have come more to the fore.
But one of the things we discuss is whether they are driven by circumstance in the moment and then will sort of fade back into the background over the next 5 years or so, or if they're here to stay in terms of imperatives.
Well, I'm trying to think of a single thing in society where, as anything develops, any idea, any sport, hobby, bit of technology, whatever it is, inevitably you get more and more and more and more choice. I'm trying to think of something where less choice becomes the evolution. I don't think people will go to having less choice about what they want to do from their 9 to 5. So they will expect more choice will evolve, and therefore, if they have choice, they're going to choose the thing that's better for them.
I'm desperately trying to understand what you mean, and I don't get it. So I think as far as the choice goes and that, surely it's a matter of reducing choice and going, actually, these are the standards for all the buildings that are just taken as a given in 5 years' time, for instance, with quality of air, quality of light, those sort of things, and setting new benchmarks for those? Or do you think they'd be really important for a couple of years and then people won't be talking about them so much?
I think it normalises, doesn't it? Something like BREEAM, which the building standard.
One of my favourite cheeses.
BREEAM, don't quote me on when BREEAM came about, maybe it's like 20 years ago. And it's setting a standard across building developments, environmental performance and thermal performance, etc. like that. BREEAM very good, which people were trying to attain to get to, is now almost like building regs minimum now. You can't really build a new building that isn't BREEAM very good. Whether you get the standard or not is your choice, but it just becomes normal and accepted. And, therefore, if you give people choice, that's the minimum, isn't it?
Well, that segues nicely onto Paul Richardson's episode from CEG, because that was about the badges of sustainability and what a complex issue it is. and how clients are often put off by the cost and the complexity, and how there are different ways to measure the same sort of things and different standards. So what were your main takeouts from that conversation? Well, roughly the same, I guess.
Oh, I really liked Paul. I thought CEG full of passion about what they were doing in terms of buildings.
The door's been answered. Dieter's gas stove has been fixed. Very simple job. 2 taps of a screwdriver done. Dieter could have done it himself, but that's fine. We were talking about the podcast episode with CG's Paul Richardson. One of the points that came up in Paul's episode was he was fascinated by the changing dynamics between landlords and tenants, and how landlords have got to now treat tenants as more of clients rather than sort of adversarial opponents. A bit of a tautology. You're involved in those conversations all the time, Dieter. How do you see that relationship shifting when you're out there?
Well, he was absolutely spot on, wasn't he, about the way the market has changed. How's that going to develop? I think the thing is, the interaction between landlords and the occupiers is much stronger because of the amount of services that those landlords are providing. And if you look at something like EQ, which is one of the buildings we were talking about, which is a fantastic new development in Bristol, there are a huge amount of space which the landlord retains being provided to the occupiers, restaurant, cafe, communal spaces, auditoriums, etc. So there's going to be more relationship because there's more points, I suppose, to be considered around what that service agreement is. Equally, like anything, occupiers are just demanding more. So we talked a little bit about the environmental credentials, the energy efficiency credentials, and the facilities that they provide. There's just more pressure on those guys to add a little extra. And if you can add a bit extra into the quality of service and the quality of the relationship, you those things just add to the value proposition for an occupier.
So you're a landlord, you've got a maybe slightly older property, you're looking at the market. What are the first 3 things you sort out to be competitive?
Well, energy efficiency and the sustainability credentials, absolutely forefront, I think, for lots and lots of occupiers, which is brilliant, and it's completely changed in the last few years, I think, certainly in the market here in the Southwest. You've got to activate the ground floor, those difficult to rent ground floor spaces.
What do you mean by activate it?
Well, I think, let's hope the times when you have office buildings where when you're walking down the street and you're on the side of an office building and it's just a load of clad, no depth, no visibility to that building, it's just the car park or something like that. That's not good. It's not good for the cityscapes. It's not good for the way it feels when you walk around a town or a city. And also, it doesn't add any value to the landlord. He can't rent it out for very much, or it's a bit dull. So what they're doing is they're activating those ground floors by getting co-working or flex lease operators in there. They're putting cafes in there. They're putting shared services in there. They're putting spaces that all occupiers can use. That is really, really important. And that is definitely something I would focus on if I was going to refurbish a building.
Nice. Seems like I finished then, but I asked for 3 points. That was
Oh, you did ask for 3 points. Well, at least you can count. What would be the third thing? It's the experience, isn't it? This is the thing the flex lease and the co-working operators have done so well. We went to go and see X and Y, and this is something that they had done brilliantly. Also, Runway East, who are clients of ours, do brilliantly. You walk in, the days of the ex-military or ex-police force security guy on the front desk demanding for you to sign a load of paperwork before you're given access through the gates, hopefully they've gone, and it's all about a massive smile. Welcome to our building. How can I help you? Do you want a coffee? And that immediate sense that you're in the right place. That is so, so important.
Nice. Point 3, smashed it. I got there in the end. Awesome. We moved on from that one, from sort of talk about buildings, properties, to culture. And that was when I was having a chat with Amy Keane. What do you want to ask me?
Amy Keane? I'm really interested. One of the things that is quite interesting about that is that I can't remember the exact title of that podcast, but I thought you had a typo and accidentally put it on Spotify.
Bagels do not accompany culture make. It's just a very literary style quote, so that's all. I wouldn't expect you to understand it, but let's carry on.
It was
definitely our sweariest guest. Absolutely love talking to Amy. Like, absolute firecracker, doing loads of good work across lots of different boards.
She was definitely not afraid to speak her mind. She had some very strong opinions on mental health first aiders at work and about toxic cultures. It seemed that you had shared experience of toxic cultures in the past. That you weren't quite revealing in that podcast, but I sense that you knew exactly what she meant.
I think, well, my background's in media agencies and stuff like that, and they work people quite hard on often fairly low salaries until you're quite senior. And they try and make up for that with strong cultures, everyone going out drinking together, lots of social stuff. And that, in hindsight, really feels like it's papering over some fundamental cracks in what's wrong. And I think that's what Amy identified really well. I think talking to her, what I really liked is amongst all that, there's lots of very nuanced, practical outtakes as well, which is really interesting to hear. So stuff like training teams in active listening, actually making a real foundational difference to how business operates, wouldn't have occurred to me, but actually makes loads and loads of sense for how people communicate and get on. Stuff like that was really interesting. And I think understanding stuff like whether people are happy to post about the place they work for and share stuff on social, and whether they're engaged on digital platforms and things like that, all being quite nuanced indicators of a healthy culture was really good. But she also swears like a trooper, which I like a lot. And I think it is, I'm seeing more and more, naming and shaming might be a bit hard, but I'm seeing more like on Reddit, on subforums, on all these platforms, people are starting to stand up to toxic cultures. The stuff that happened with Brewdog. There's a massive anti-work sub on Reddit where people are starting to name and shame employers who treat their employees really badly. That stuff feels like it's gaining a lot of ground, and you want to be on the right side of that. And I think that's a really interesting mix to get into.
Yeah, the leverage of power between the businesses and the people who work within them has been shifting for a long time, but it feels like, social media adds another notch to that shift of leverage because they're able to just say, well, there you go, it's out there. And you can get enough momentum that suddenly Brewdog's a very good example of this. It's like, well, how are you going to respond to that? Which they did a pretty terrible job at responding. And it was really interesting having her view on it.
And it gets leaked straight away because people now won't stand for it. And yes, it's not, you can't paper over those cracks anymore, I think. So it's so important to get that culture right. And actually going back to that point about the mental health first aiders thing, one of the reasons I really like that conversation was because when Amy expanded on that point, I thought, that absolutely feels true, which is that having mental health first aiders in a business might be a way for a business to pass off responsibility for that stuff onto people whose day job it isn't. And it hadn't really occurred to me before, but then now I see it in a whole different light. And there were loads of things in that podcast that shifted my perspective a bit.
Okay, I didn't agree with her on this point.
Did you not?
No. So I think what she was saying, and I do agree on the point that you can't shift your responsibilities as a business onto a few individuals who happen to have taken a course. However, is it not better that a few individuals have taken that course? Because we have mental health first aiders at Interaction. Lots of our clients have them. You are one. Those people who have done that course, and maybe it's, even if it's a 4-hour long suggested token course, those people will walk out of that course being better equipped to deal with a situation than when they walked into it. And they will be more likely to see somebody else who's having struggles. So they're going to have better visibility and they're going to be better able to deal with it. That you're right, it doesn't remove the responsibility of the business, but that has got to be a better place than if you don't do it.
Maybe, but that's something that comes right in at the end of somebody's process. So we were doing some webinars a little while ago on culture at work and well-being specifically. And one of the things that came from that, I think it was Tom from Varn, made a really good point where he was talking about addressing well-being and using COVID as a way to take stock and stuff. And he was like, rather than do Pilates classes and mental health and tennis, we took that opportunity to focus our resource on fundamentally fixing things that were stressing people out. So how we deal with clients or how we manage workflows or whatever those things might be. That seems a much better, more responsible use of a business's resource than taking everyone out for a business going, okay, we'll put everyone into training for a day and that problem is now fixed and everyone's mental health is fine. That's the perspective.
But it doesn't have to be an either or.
No,
so the thing that Tom from Varn talks about is that, or we took that time to think about our processes or our output or how we interface with clients. Shouldn't you be doing that anyway?
Well, seeing as he's probably going to listen to this, I'm sure he does do that anyway. Yes,
I'm sure he does that all the time. They've got a great business and he's a very intelligent, bright, motivated chap.
Keep going.
I'm sure he does that all the time, but we should all do that all the time. And yes, it's not about just dealing with the stress. It is about how did the stress get there in the first place, and how can we fundamentally change the structure, the process, the requirements to stop that stress happening. But this is about dealing with the source.
And I think in the world we work in, you realise that all those things are really complex, aren't they? Like mental health is as much as we touched on the stuff, Joanna Watchman, about your quality of light and access to outdoor areas or whatever those things might be, in good air quality, as it is about having mental health first aider on site, as it is about having yoga classes, as it is about having structures in place that support you when stuff gets a bit much. So the answer there, Dieter, is who knows?
Well, it's a very good link into Harry Singer.
Yes,
Singer Instruments, because I was very impressed that they'd obviously been recognised by the HSE, hadn't they, for the work they'd done on mental health. And obviously that's something that was well funded and well resourced within their business. I thought he was absolutely brilliant and clearly faced with a massive challenge of talent with their business being in on Exmoor, but embracing the people who want to work with them. I mean, he was a lot about...
Just words, Dieter. Just choose a word and say it.
Psychological
safety.
So that was the phrase I was looking for. Which hopefully... So he was greatly about psychological safety and the importance of that in their business. What was your take?
There were several sort of takeouts from that. Like, it was a fascinating chat because he's a fascinating fella. PhD in quantum chaos, which he explained to me and I still don't really understand. We discussed beforehand quite a lot about psychological safety, which I can't say, before the podcast. And when I asked it on the podcast, his answer was actually much more succinct than in our previous discussions, which was just don't employ dickheads, which I was expecting quite a long and analytical comment, and that was pretty clear and to the point. So I enjoyed that, but also his framework about celebrating failure and whenever that happens, and celebrating that in leadership and across the floor, and making that very visible that if somebody fails, it means they're trying, and that is a safe space to fail in, and you don't get innovation without failure, and therefore failure should be rewarded. It sort of seems like a fairly straightforward point, but actually it's really hard to remember that in the flurry of day-to-day business, I think.
Yeah. Well, toxic cultures and blame cultures are, they're pretty much one and the same, aren't they? And if you remove a blame culture and just say, look, we all make mistakes, but it needs the leadership to say, we make mistakes too. And you have to create that environment where you're happy for people to call you out and say, I don't know if that's aligned with our values, and I don't know if you've made the right decision there. And you need to be able to say, okay, let me have a think about it. Let's talk about it. And they may not always be right, and you may not always be right, but having the conversation is good.
And that leads on to something that's come up quite a lot in webinars and podcasts and all sorts of chats we've been having, which is about leadership exposing their vulnerabilities more and leading in a sort of different style where they put vulnerabilities to the fore and try and help everyone else open up about their own and creating those sort of safe arenas. So that's come up specifically with some tech companies we've been talking to as well. And, whether that's sort of mental health or areas of innovation they fail at or stuff they're not very good at. I think we're now seeing those vulnerabilities turn into sort of leadership superpowers almost that are a lot more energizing and encouraging for the people that work into them.
Yeah, that's a tool that's being used for a long time. Someone like Renee Brown actually is the leadership with vulnerability kind of champ, isn't it? The one that people would know. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people would say that's a tool that they're engaging, but it was actually forced on a lot of people by the pandemic, because you cannot be the big tough boss when suddenly you're doing a video from home or a meeting from home, and your 3-year-old child comes in and starts hitting you with a stick or something like that, whatever they might do. I don't know if that's what. And it changes the conversation, and I think that's a brilliant thing. If there's silver linings to be had of all the other chaos, that's a really, really good thing. And weirdly, didn't we all feel more connected to each other because we could see into each other's living rooms, we met each other's partners and dogs and children, and we all became more vulnerable, we all became more normal, we all became more aligned. There wasn't that difference between us all.
A bit more humanity in work, a bit more lifefulness at work maybe. Yeah. But on the vulnerabilities point, I'm glad you're open to that conversation, because I've actually made a spreadsheet here of 100 of your vulnerabilities, which I thought we could discuss one by one. So lifefulness is something that Sanderson Jones talked about, and that was a brilliant chat that I know Sanderson from way back, so I very much enjoyed having that conversation with him about bringing your full self to work and those sort of things.
I particularly enjoyed the part where he revealed, of course, that you and him know each other through both being stand-up comedians, and you moved on very quickly from the point then.
Yeah, well, it's not about me, is it? So let's crack on. I mean, it should be, but it isn't, so that's fine. Yeah, we knew each other from a while back on the comedy circuit, and he's obviously got a huge amount of transferable skills and, charisma, and he puts a lot of thought into how people perceive things and the way people communicate best. And he's used all those to do some incredible work, I think.
Yeah, so, I mean, the take home for me from that was like, think about your office as a church. and I was like, yes. And
also no.
It was a non-religious or a church. But, isn't that great? It's just the place where people come together. And one of the really nice sort of small things he talked about when he was comparing it to churches, there's somebody who does the flowers and they sort of end up having a small group with the other people who do the flowers, and there's somebody who does the music, and there's someone who tidies, does the gardening and things like that. And he's right. I think lots of our clients are rapidly expanding tech businesses, and they go from being these relatively small businesses, which the culture just kind of works because everyone kind of knows each other. That's how the business comes together, and everybody's very connected to the founders or the leadership. They can see each other's vulnerabilities. And then suddenly you go from being 10 to 20 to 50 to 100 to 200 people, and they're expecting the same culture to just exist, and they still want to do everything together. And you can't. It's just too big. And suddenly when you start putting in hybrid working into that, you never really get everybody together.
So we've done that, the brilliant segue there, to push our tech culture survival guide, which we've got as a white paper. One of the points in that is about scaling. And when you hit a certain point, you then have to reduce those groups again so they feel bonded and collaborative, because you can't spread that across a big group of people. You have to have smaller subgroups than that feel ownership over what they're doing, feel connected to the other groups in there. And it's about bringing things that people are good at and letting them do more of it. And that might, like interaction, I think identified, but people have identified what their sort of roles are in the business and what elements they're going to have, the social stuff and the event stuff and the internal bits. And people have all settled into those roles as well, haven't they? So that point, I think... Really
nobody said that we're good at podcasts. Did you notice that?
No, they're good. But give us 5-6 years. We'll be there.
Polishing those skills.
By the time podcasts are Neuralinked directly into your brain, we'll probably have mastered it.
Yes. But, he was all about the kind of that bringing people together, that church, if you like, and the need to be purposeful about it. Don't just expect the connections and the bonding to have. Very similar to what Lucy was saying. That clearly works for them. I'd be really keen to get on one of those day things.
I think one of the points made is about people resourcing stuff properly, and companies will spend loads of money on an AGM or an away day or an event for the staff, but they won't really want to spend money on making sure that runs smoothly, someone owns the whole experience, somebody's planned it through properly. And it's really easy to overlook those things. But I think getting someone external in to do those things can be really valuable to business.
Yeah, there's something about, we structure meetings at Interaction and we plan those things out. Sometimes when you're putting them on paper, they feel a bit American and cheesy.
Yeah.
But they do work. If you do have an icebreaker.
And they often are quite cheesy, but that can be all right as well.
It's okay.
It's fine.
But not everybody has it in them to not rise above it, but to embrace it.
Yeah.
And just make themselves the fool, or to be the person who kind of pushes it through. Because there's always that little bit of resistance. And that's where someone like Sanderson, he clearly has those skills.
Objective and authoritative, who's external, can come in and do that, where it's hard to drive internally sometimes, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So massive switch up between that and the next subject, which was Rupert Dean from X and Y, co-working space with purpose. That was one you hosted, and I found it really, X and Y have got such a strong proposition, and it's so clear what they are, where they sit in the market, the sort of businesses who will be attracted to them. I was left thinking about how successful that proposition would probably be based on its positioning, and how difficult it might get for other co-working spaces who may be just relying on a space and a vague sense of community. What's it going to take for co-working companies to be really successful over the next couple of years?
Yeah, you're right. So their purpose is really strong. So, this is where the expectations are lifting. It's running parallels into the things with CubeX and with CEG around development. Yes, it's now just expected that the space is going to be really, really good. It's going to be expected that it's got a nice, friendly person, there's decent coffee and there's decent snacks, and the meeting rooms work properly and the AV works properly. That was the USP to those businesses 10 years ago. It's got to rise above it. And the ones who will be most successful are the ones that are really, really clear of the types of businesses that you will be collaborating with or will be your building co-workers, if you like. So to be successful, I think you've got to start bringing something together. Interesting, in the pandemic, there was lots of talk around these regional hubs where the thing that might connect people as your co-workers might be the location that you live in rather than be the sector that you're in or the business that you work for. I haven't quite seen that yet.
That seems one of those pandemic ideas that disappeared quite quietly, it feels like.
Yes, I don't know. And maybe it's because I think people have realised that they do need to travel potentially to see their colleagues. It isn't just enough to be in a workplace and just do it all online. You do need to have that connection, very much in line with what Sanderson.
Those are sort of some key themes that have touched on all the episodes, I think. What do you reckon we'll be talking about at the end of next year in terms of the podcast we've done and some of the themes we're going to see come to the fore next year?
Well, I think this is going out in 2022. So I think at the end of this year, in 2022, the challenges which I consistently see our clients talking about, everything, it's all about hybrid, where you, up until the kind of more recent restrictions pre-Christmas in 2021, everyone was like back in the office, or people were finding their way back in and they were trying to find the right way about it. And there was a need to not tell people to come in, but make it a destination and to come in. But then we had this thing where it was very hybrid. And how does a business deal with a hybrid situation? How do we cope when not everybody's in at the same time, when certain people will never meet because they don't work on the same days? Dealing with meetings where some people are in the room and some people are out the room, that is a massive challenge. And I think it's something that, you know, if you're involved in AV for offices, there must be a massive amount of focus on sorting that situation out, because it does not work at all. I can't really think of a decent bit of tech that does that well.
No, and it feels like those conversations start off quite big picture and abstract. Hybrid, how do you make it work? Very quickly go down into the weeds of the detail of, well, if he's on a headset and she's on the phone and they're in a room, and how do we get these teams to cross paths even though they're not in the office? And it very quickly goes down right into the granular aspects of how you run your business and run your meetings and stuff, doesn't it? Yeah. So interesting to see how that evolves.
I think definitely what we're going to see, and I can sense it speaking out in the market, there's been a lot of talk about what's good for the people and what's good for the teams and what's good for the individual. And the conversation about what's good for the business has been less public, I think. But definitely those conversations are starting to happen. You can't just allow everybody to have total freedom to come in and out whenever they want and to maybe be in a meeting or maybe be online and not in that meeting. You have to start setting some parameters around it. It is difficult whilst the pandemic is still going on to start to set that agenda. But I think that's the conversation that's going to be quite strong in 2022.
Yeah, and it's one of the points that one of our webinar guests made was allowing your team to work totally remotely is abdicating responsibility as much as saying you need to be in the office 5 days a week. It's sort of dictating stuff, both equally lazy perhaps if they're not properly thought through and strategized. But you'll get, if you allow everyone to work from home full time, you're giving up your input into their welfare, you're giving up their input into, whether they are being progressed at work and maybe pushing through stuff that's uncomfortable for them but makes them grow. There's a lot of things to consider no matter what end of the spectrum you fall on, aren't there? And I think businesses feel reticent to discuss that stuff because it looks quite bad when everyone's suddenly thinking about wellness and employee well-being and the individual and those sort of things. So
yeah, delicate conversations, aren't they? But we're going to banish boring offices.
That's what we do.
Because you have to. Nobody's going to go.
No.
Nobody's going to do a bad commute to go into a toxic culture, to a place where they don't feel bonded, where there isn't really rituals that are managed and curated with their colleagues, and in a bad office environment with bad acoustics, bad lighting, bad levels of natural light, all the things that we consistently been talking to. I think that is where the market is going, and that's where the expectations are.
Nice. Good way to wrap up series 2.
Well, let's hope those predictions are correct. So luckily for us, a few people might listen to this at the start of 2022. The chances of anyone listening to it again to check whether we were correct or not, I would say is low. So on that basis,
And
we'll be okay.
we should probably give a reward. If anyone listens at the end of 2022 and comes back to us on these predictions, they can have what?
It's so unlikely. We can't think of anything.
I'll just say Dieter just mimed something at me then, but non-verbalised. Cool. We'll wrap.
It's a wrap.
It's a wrap.
Loved it.
Happy
Cheers,
2022. Bye.